Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. And I'm joined by my recovering partner in this enterprise, Eliot Cohen, the Robert Osgood Professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Eliot, welcome back, and please introduce our very special guest for today.
Well, thank you, Eric. So our guest today is Andrew Roberts, who is, from an academic's point of view, a depressingly prolific writer of big books that actually people want to read. And of course, there's nothing you could do, Andrew, that would more offend most professors. Let me just mention a few of the books. There's, of course, his monumental biography, one-volume biography of Churchill. As somebody who's done a bit of work on Churchill myself, it is far and away the best biography of Churchill that's out there. There's a collective biography, Masters and Commanders, about leadership in World War II. There's a biography of Lord Halifax, the Holy Fox, biography of Salisbury, of Napoleon. I could go on, but I would get downcast if I did that. We're here, though, to talk about his most recent book, which I'm enjoying immensely, The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. And I think just to put you at your ease, Andrew, I should say that I can't speak for Eric, but I know for myself, by temperament, I would have been a loyalist. I'm pretty sure of that. So, you should not expect excessive bashing of dear old King George from me. Eric, I don't know, where are you on that?
As a Foreign Service officer, I had to take the Myers-Briggs personality profile several times. And at one point in my career, someone looked at my profile and said, "You have the profile of a juvenile delinquent," which probably suggests that I would have been with George Washington and his hearty band of revolutionaries. But Eliot, look, I've long ago forgiven you your passion for defending Benedict Arnold, so not to worry.
Well, don't get me started on Benedict Arnold, the true hero of the American Revolution. But we're not here to talk about us. We're here to talk with you, Andrew, about this terrific book. I think to give people a sense of what's in it, and then we'd like to draw you out on it. It is I think it's fair to say, a fair but quite sympathetic biography of George III, who is indeed misunderstood, who you portray very convincingly, not only simply as decent a human being as a king can be, but as somebody who didn't want what he got and was certainly very far away from being the kind of monster that he certainly was portrayed in the United States, at least, during the Revolution and thereafter. Am I getting it right?
I think so, but it's perfectly understandable, of course, to misrepresent your enemy. It's almost, you take that for granted in war, that you're going to be putting out propaganda which blackens the name of your enemy. I think that is just part of warfare. What's so strange is that for 200 years since then, when our countries have both been friends, the historians, especially the Whig historians, have continued to bash out poor old George III and treat him as though all of those things that were said in the Declaration of Independence, for example, were literally true.
Yeah. Well, kind of like the way people have treated Benedict Arnold, but I digress.
Well, needless to say, I agree with you on the Benedict Arnold side, but nonetheless, I don't want to put off all of our listeners today.
Well, there's I think there's an interesting larger point here. Andrew, one of the things I really admire enormously about your work is you give us different viewpoints on people who we thought we knew. That goes back to Halifax, who I think frequently gets tarred as something of an appeaser when he was something rather different than that. Your admiration of Churchill, which is, again, I think fair and critical where it should be critical, which is actually swimming a bit against the tide. So I wonder if we could draw you out a bit. You talk about the Whig historians. That's WHIG. Well, who are they and why are they still that way today? And is there a broader observation maybe you'd like to make about the nature of history writing right now?
Yes, well, the Whig historians, to start off, were, and thank you very much for all the kind things you said earlier, and it's a great honour to be on the show. The Whig historians were very often actually related to the Whig politicians, who were the people who started the Glorious Revolution of 1689 and who George III opposed politically for many of the years, most of the years of his long reign. He was the longest reigning king of England, nearly 60 years. And so the historians, who, as I say, were related to them by blood and marriage very often, and had the same political opinions, which were the liberal, radical, and liberal opinions of the day, continued to be very much in the mainstream of history, not just in the 18th century, but also throughout the 19th century and indeed into the 20th century. And so George III gets a pretty heavy rap from the British Whig historians, and of course, much more understandably, also from American historians. So overall, whether or not there's a broader thing to assume from that, that history tends to be written, of course, by the victors, I think is so obvious as to be banal.
Yeah. But don't you think in some ways, I mean, Churchill, obviously very different character, also has taken something of a battering from a lot of the people who write history now. I mean, obviously through the 60s, I think you could say, or at least some part of the 60s, he simply was this iconic figure who you did not criticize. And that has really changed. I mean, I've really been quite struck by that. Do you see something there that's worth exploring?
I think so. Well, I mean, it went too far in the 1960s, frankly. Yeah, I mean, there were lots of things one can criticise Winston Churchill for. There were lots of things he got wrong, lots of blunders he made. I could list 6 or 7 for you right away. But the fact was that on the big issues, the great issues, the ones that really mattered in the 20th century, seeing the rise of Hitler, the way in which he helped create the grand strategy that ultimately defeated Hitler, being one of the first people to see the threat posed by Soviet communism, he was right. And so my problem really with the revisionist Churchill historians, of whom, as you say, there are many, many of them, and there are many more to come, unfortunately. There's another terrible book that's about to be published next month about Churchill, in fact. The fact is that you have to do 2 things. First of all, of course, you have to stay rigidly within the evidence, which a lot of these revisionist historians simply don't. And the other thing is, of course, you have to try and see him through the lens of his own time. And to place 21st century mores on a 20th century figure is profoundly ahistorical and really doesn't help you understand that figure in the slightest.
Andrew, I certainly would love to stay on Churchill, and I will come back to him, but I want to, just before we depart good King George, you do a lovely job of depicting in all of your books, actually, the human side of the figures who we're talking about, which I think we sometimes lose sight of in history. I mean, these people were human beings with the same strengths, weaknesses, passions, peculiarities that all of us, have. And in particular, I think you do a lovely job of contrasting him with his grandfather, who really does seem like a rather horrid figure, George II. But you also are not immune to criticizing some of his failures in statecraft, in particular, parts of how he handled the revolutionary crisis, his inflexibility, etc. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, how do you see him as a war leader, and why did the character, which you describe so positively, not come through in the policy realm?
Partly it was because he was not the primary maker of policy. He was a constitutional monarch. He was a limited monarch. Ever since the Glorious Revolution, kings didn't make policy. That was done by the politicians and the statesmen, of whom he was very unfortunate that really of the 14 prime ministers that he appointed in his long reign, only 2 of them were any good, were remarkable, should I say. And William Pitt, the elder, was too ill, frankly, to be prime minister, and wasn't an effective prime minister at the very early stage of the American Revolution. And William Pitt the Younger was not on the scene at all during the American Revolution or the War of Independence. So you have this this problem that he had tremendously second-rate statesmen like Lord North, Lord George Germain, and others who he was working through. And also, of course, the generals, once the war had broken out, were not of the finest quality. Up against him and the British side, you had a polymath of the status of Benjamin Franklin, a charismatic leader of men like George Washington, a financial genius like Alexander Hamilton. You had Madison and Monroe, and a wordsmith like Thomas Jefferson, a politician of John Adams's status. For an Englishman, I have to say it's completely infuriating that in the 1770s, America managed to bring together all of these geniuses and giants, whilst we had Lord Cornwallis, Sir William Howe, and Lord North.
I once was visiting the Carlton Club, the home of the Conservatives in London, and I was staggered to see a large portrait of Lord North front and center. And, it just struck me as,
it's ridiculous. It's
is this really the guy?
And he was a Whig politician. He'd have only ever called himself a Whig politician. We shouldn't have him in that club.
Yeah, I mean, I found it very bizarre. Could you talk to us a little bit about, I think the American caricature of him is, to some extent, this somewhat severe tyrannical picture. I mean, you quote from the musical Hamilton, which I think plays to that stereotype, unfortunately. But I think the other thing that first, we don't know anything about his career or his reign after the American Revolution. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, the question of his illness. And many things I learned from the book is that I had always assumed that he had porphyria. And what you're suggesting is, no, that he probably had bipolar disorder.
Yes, he did not. He did not suffer from porphyria, as the show The Madness of King George, for example, makes out. It was bipolar disorder affective type 1, and all of the medical opinion, it's not just me who says that now, it's accepted that was the case, because the people who originally came up with the porphyria thesis essentially misled doctors with the symptoms that they gave doctors in the 1960s. Which was a very unethical, frankly, thing to have done. It's all in the appendix of my book. With regard to his, and one of the interesting things is that even whatever mental illness he suffered from, it wouldn't have made any effect or difference to the American Revolution, because his major outbreak wasn't until 1788, which was 5 years after America became independent. So that too is a great sort of misunderstanding. The idea that because he was mad, he lost the colonies is completely wrong. With regard to his career after 1783, there is an enormous amount to say, and I somehow managed, I think, to squeeze it into about 5 chapters, because as you say, it's not the most important part of his life, but nonetheless, he was the king throughout the Napoleonic Wars, and he learnt many of the lessons of the American War of Independence, and he put them to good use in Napoleonic Wars, which eventually were fought to a victorious outcome. Although by that stage, by the time of the Battle of Waterloo, he was completely insane. He was also blind and deaf and suffering from senile dementia. So the last chapter is a pretty pathos-laden one, but nonetheless, his post-American life, as it were, was a very strong and important and powerful one.
I have to say, one thing that has always struck me about him is the way in which, disappointment isn't the word for it, the profound blow that losing the American colonies must have been. He dealt with it in a more productive way, and perhaps in a more generous way than one might have expected. And, the famous compliment he pays to George Washington, but really a whole bunch of things. I mean, it's quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, well, the reference you're making is to March 1797, when Washington gave up the presidency, and he said he was the finest character of the age. But he also said something that was tremendously impressive, I think, and gracious to John Adams, who was the first American ambassador to the court of St. James in London. And he said on meeting him in June 1785, "I'll be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, and I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power." I think that's a pretty good thing for him to have said, really, and again, gracious.
Yeah, really quite an extraordinarily statesmanlike thing to have said. To what extent did the loss of the American colonies really damage his standing with British elites and the British public?
Much less than you'd imagine, because even as early after the Treaty of Paris that ended that war, as December 1783, so only a few months after the Treaty of Paris, he was in a political position to get rid of the Whig government and impose William Pitt the Younger, the 24-year-old Prime Minister, a decision that was subsequently vindicated by Pitt the Younger's landslide victory in the subsequent general election. It was the only time that he actually, in his whole 60-year reign, actually imposed a Prime Minister who did not have the support of the majority of the House of Commons. The Whig historians make him out to be a sort of evil dictator for having done that, but he did it because the radical Whigs were going to try to nationalise the East India Company for their own benefit. And as I say, it turned out to be supported by the people in the general election. But it's a astonishing thing, really, that within only a few months he was politically strong enough to be able to do that.
What explains that? I mean, what explains that he remains a reasonably popular monarch even after the American Revolution?
He wasn't blamed for the defeat in America, primarily. The Americans, of course, because of that laser-like ad hominem attack on him in the Declaration of Independence, those 28 clauses which blame him entirely for absolutely everything. He is a major figure, therefore, in the American War of Independence to American minds. But the British people didn't think of that at the time. They, quite understandably, and in my view rightly, blamed the government, and they brought down the government of Lord North in the February of 1782, and they actually concentrated on the people who were really responsible, rather than the king, who was essentially signing off things that were agreed by the cabinet and the government.
Andrew, I wonder if we can broaden our discussion, to really your previous book, which talks about war and leadership. And this has been a leitmotif, really, of your work, going back to, as Eliot mentioned, your biography of Lord Halifax, but also you've written books about leaders who were opposed to one another, Napoleon and Wellington, Churchill and Hitler. You've written the biography of Churchill, written a magnificent biography of Napoleon. What are the major, for you, sort of elements of statecraft in war? You've also just launched, I might add, a new podcast on the Secrets of Statecraft that the Hoover Institution is sponsoring. So what lessons from all of this study of history have you taken out of this about what we need in a leader in wartime?
I think in that book, in the Leadership in War book, there's an essay on Napoleon, and in the course of it, I think there are 20 aspects of Napoleonic leadership that I write about, and if a leader can have a large number of them, then I think you've pretty much cracked it. But having said that, of course, Napoleon did lose. So it's not necessarily you need things on top of the list of these 20 things. I'd say amongst them are a sense of timing, a good deal of luck is quite useful, a powerful oratory, the capacity to tell people bad news. Politicians don't like to do that in general, but if you're trusted enough by the people to tell them bad news, then that's always a good thing. Propaganda, techniques. That's pretty much a prerequisite for a successful war leader. A sort of honesty with the public, and an ability to talk straight to the public, to move their hearts, as Napoleon said, to electrify the soul. These are things that that a lot of people do not have, but which great war leaders tend to be able to have. There are lots of others. The capacity to delegate successfully, obviously, to people who you have chosen and trust and admire. That you have to be quite a butcher to be able to ruthlessly sack people who are underperforming. Is a pretty essential. Even if they're friends of yours, even if they're close to you politically, and so on, you've got to get rid of them if they're not performing. It's a long list, as I say. There are 18 or 20 of them, and of course not every leader has all of them. And although Napoleon did, and as I say, the recipe for success is not total, owing to the fact that Napoleon himself was defeated.
One of the things that's very impressive about your work is, the way most academics do it is we write the same book over and over again, 3 or 4 times. And after you've done it twice, you get tenure. And after you've done it 3 times, then you get to be a full professor. And you don't do that.
Well, I'm not an academic. That's the thing. I'm a visiting professor at places, but nobody pays my pension apart from my readers.
that makes it scarier. So here's the thing. I'm very curious. You really have been willing to tackle very different periods: Churchill, Napoleon, George III. How, when you're about to leap into a new field and a new individual, how do you go about it? I'm just curious about the workmanship of it.
I sort of try to do the opposite of what a tenured academic might do, owing to the fact that it strikes me that certainly over the last 40 years or so since I was at university, the subject areas that tenured academics are interested in getting involved in have become smaller and smaller. They tend to like to specialize in smaller and smaller subject areas, and as a result, it has allowed non-tenured people, freelance historians like me, to occupy a much bigger space, which happens also to be the space that the public are interested in reading books about. So what I won't do is, if, as in the case of Winston Churchill, there are 1,009 biographies of Winston Churchill that have been written, I won't let that put me off. Whereas, and that might be hubristic and absurd in a way, but you shouldn't just not write a book because an awful lot of other people have already written one. Ditto, of course, Napoleon. But if there is an area where somebody hasn't written a good book for 50 years, which is the case of George III, in terms of a cradle to the grave life of George III, then that's an added attraction, of course, as well. I'm presently about to submit a book proposal for a life of Disraeli. And no one's written a really good biography of Disraeli, cradle to the grave, for 60 years. And so that's also a rather, if there's a gap in the market like that, then it's attractive to try and fill it.
And how do you, let's say, okay, with a book like a biography of Disraeli, do you go out and say, I'm going to read all the other biographies of Disraeli and figure out what are the questions that they're not tackling? Do you go straight for the documents? How do you, what are the mechanics?
You buy the 12 volumes, 10 volumes actually in his case, of his letters, and you sit down and read them. You're getting straight into the mind of the man. You do not worry about what people wrote in the 19th century in the biographies of those 3-volume biographies that, or in Disraeli's case, 6 volumes biographies that the Victorians wrote. You get down and start with the actual hard evidence. At least that's what I do. Every historian's got their own way of going about it. Some historians actually start writing as soon as they're writing the book as soon as they get the evidence. I can't do that because I'm always terrified that right at the end of collecting my evidence, I'm going to discover something new, which will have thereby forced me to rip up everything that I'd written up until then. So there it is.
I must say, I was particularly curious to hear that because after I finish my current book, I want to do one on Theodore Roosevelt.
Ah, wonderful.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about how to tackle it, so I'll take that as advice.
Well, but Eliot, I'm very interested because, of course, when I go lecturing at the New York Historical Society, which I did just the other day, and walked past the now non-existent statue of
Yes.
Roosevelt, you're going to have to face, in many ways, the same kind of sort of politically correct woke issues with regard to Roosevelt that I've had to do with Winston Churchill,
Right.
and it'll be interesting to see how you tackle them because they are very contentious. Certainly in my country, and I know in yours as well, they are very contentious and can be pretty hard fought.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to making more enemies. But that actually raises another question. Then I'll throw it back to Eric. I mean, one of the things you have flourished as a conservative intellectual, even though the literary culture of the UK is, I mean, it may be more balanced than it is here. I mean, you've got The Spectator and so on. But on the whole, I mean, you do get quite good reviews from elements of the press that I might not have expected. That's partly, obviously, a commentary on your work. Is it also a commentary on British literary culture, do you think?
I think people do try and leave their political assumptions at the door when they're writing book reviews. They obviously don't when they're writing articles. That would be insane. But no, I think the reason that I get perfectly reasonable and fair reviews from left-wing papers is that there is a tradition of not imposing one's politics on book reviewing.
Don't underestimate, Andrew, the fact that you write beautifully, which is all too rare a attribute among contemporary historians. So you can write incredibly long books that people actually want to read, which is a tribute to you. I wanted to for a moment tie some of this conversation to our immediate concerns, and in particular, I mean, I'm not sure if you saw it or if you did, Eliot, but I watched. Happens to be we're recording this today when Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the United States Congress in what was, I thought, an immensely moving, very well executed speech. And in that sense, when he spoke to the House of Commons not too long ago, he clearly was echoing Churchill in his rhetoric. Today, he echoed in some ways Martin Luther King, but was also very Churchillian in his rhetoric. And people have compared Zelensky to Churchill. And as someone who's sitting in Central Europe now, observing this kind of war at close hand, but also someone who's written more than one book about Winston Churchill, what do you make of that comparison? How do you think about it?
I think it's a valid one. I do think that President Zelensky is showing Churchillian leadership. I think we mentioned earlier about all the various aspects of leadership. I think that President Zelensky is showing an awful lot of that list that I gave you. He certainly has been speaking to his people in a way that doesn't underestimate the perils that they're facing. He is, as you say, paraphrasing Churchill. He said, "We shall fight in the forests, we shall fight in the streets, and so on. We shall never surrender." It's a classic and straightforward paraphrase of Churchill, and I think it's a valid analogy when one thinks that Churchill, of course, faced hundreds of days of bombing of his capital city, and he stayed there and stuck it out. That's what Zelensky's doing. He's not doing what the Afghan president did, which was to skip out of the country as quickly as soon as he could. He's staying in his capital and he's fighting, if possible, possibly to the death. And that's what Winston Churchill said he would do too. And I think that focuses the attention, of course, of the world, and also focuses the emotions of the world, because so somebody who's got the sheer guts to do that is obviously a leader to follow. And I think that the way that Zelensky is essentially channeling his inner Churchill is is both a tribute to him and also, in a sense, a posthumous tribute to Churchill himself.
I've been tempted to make a comparison to Ronald Reagan as well, because obviously both of them came out of a background as actors. Reagan had the enormous advantage of actually having been a governor of the largest state in the Union in the United States in the 1970s before he became president, which obviously gave him enormous political experience that Zelensky didn't have. I mean, Zelensky went from being an actor, a comedian, and an actor who played a comedian who became president of Ukraine to actually becoming president of Ukraine. And, his lack of political experience in the first couple of years of his presidency clearly was on display. He was elected with something like 73% of the vote, but his popularity went down, as inevitably does for politicians when they actually have to govern. But in this moment, he has incredibly risen to this moment, in part because he understands that part of leadership is performance art, and the performative piece of this, he's been really well suited to do. I don't mean to suggest that there's anything fake about what he's doing. I think it's all very, very genuine. But he understands that there's a role to be played here, and he is fulfilling that role. Am I missing something, or is that a fair comparison?
No, and actually, I think that's a very fair comparison. I go further slightly. I mean, you'll recall how Ronald Reagan, especially on the left and amongst comedians and the rest of it, they sneered at him, frankly, because he was an actor, and it was something that before he became president was held against him, that he couldn't be a serious and substantial figure for the very simple reason that he was himself an actor. And that was proved, of course, very quickly to be rubbish. And Zelensky also, the Russians attempted to sneer at him because he had been a comedian in his previous life. And boy, is he making them smile on the other side of their faces now, And I think another connection that Zelensky has with Ronald Reagan is that he's able somehow in these daily press conferences that he gives, which are directed to the world, but they're also directed to his own people. He manages to essentially summon up the essence of freedom, of what freedom is all about, of why it's worth fighting for, why it's worth, in all too many cases in Ukraine, dying for. I was in Ukraine this time last week, and speaking to Ukrainians, even ones who didn't vote for him, as you mentioned. He wasn't terribly popular in the first 2 years of his presidency, and these were people who came from ethnic backgrounds that where he's not terribly popular. And both of them have said that since the invasion, he has united the country in a way that no other politician could, and that they are inspired by him so much that their previous opposition to him is, as far as they're concerned, completely forgotten.
It strikes me that in a way what we see in Zelensky is something that it's a point that you tacitly make by the subjects you've taken for your books, which is individuals matter enormously. I mean, if Zelensky had been killed, let's say, at the very outset of this war, as I believe the Russians probably intended to do, who knows whether things would be where they are now. I mean, I am sure there would be plenty of Ukrainians fighting desperately, but it wouldn't be the same thing at all.
That's right. And the moral is to the physical, as Napoleon said, as 3 years to 1. That's the importance of morale is absolutely central, and I agree. If he'd been killed in the opening scenes of this conflict, equally the great man and women view of history has been, I think, also underlined by President Putin and his behaviour, because we can we really imagine anybody else? Any other Russian leader invading Ukraine. I mean, it does require somebody of a particular sort of form of mind that, other than President Putin, isn't terribly present in the Russian political scene at the moment that I can see. So it does underline the the correctness, I think, of Thomas Carlyle's view that the individual does matter in history, which is a slap in the face for the determinists and the Marxists and all of those other people who think that there's some kind of vast impersonal force that takes over history and there's nothing to do with individuals.
So what that makes me wonder about is, you have written about individuals who were there and made a huge difference at these really major watersheds in history, or turning points. Does your intuition as an historian tell you that this particular conflict right now is one of those, or is it one in a series of events that basically all pretty much pointed in the same direction?
I think it's a tremendously important event. I really do believe that the 24th of February 2022 is going to go down in history as an absolutely central and key moment in the post-1945 history. We're seeing the time, basically, that the Russians, or at least the Russian leader, essentially wants to start another Cold War. And is willing to, and you could find by this time next month that there's a partitioned Ukraine along the Dnieper, or in some such way that there's a Western Ukraine that doesn't have access to the sea. That's capital city is in Lviv, and therefore Russia has actually been willing to undergo all of the economic pain and to become a pariah nation in order to set up what's essentially going to be another Iron Curtain. And I think that really will be a key moment. It's going to be up there with the moment that you two guys worked for so hard, the pulling down of the Berlin Wall. It'll be up there with 9/11, with the Berlin airlift, in my view.
Andrew, I want to pick up on, sort of your comments about Putin. I mean, it's impossible to imagine this, of course, without Putin, as you say. And this is, I think, a startling event. I think a lot of people, including me, doubted that he would ultimately do something on such a large scale. I was wrong. His appetite for risk has clearly grown over the years, which I would say probably has something to do with the rewards he's gotten for risks he's taken on a smaller scale earlier. And all of that, along with the fact that, this is a premeditated, unprovoked, highly scripted war of aggression, has, turned me back to one of your favorite subjects, which is, the interwar period. And I've been rereading The Gathering Storm. And I stumbled on, in the introductory chapter, a couple of sentences, which I want to read to you and ask you to comment on in terms of how we in the West have responded to this. That is to say, how President Biden, the United States, our NATO allies have responded, because it seems to me incredibly apposite. And what he says is, as he's recounting that the story he's going to tell will provide some lessons. And he says, "We shall see how the counsels of prudence and restraint may become the prime agents of mortal danger. How the middle course, adopted from desires for safety and a quiet life, may be found to lead direct to the bullseye of disaster. And we'll see how absolute is the need of a broad path of international action pursued by many states in common across the years, irrespective of the ebb and flow of national politics." I mean, do you agree with me that this seems like a very apt description of what we have seen in terms of the West's interactions with Putin over the last 10, 15 years?
Once again, Winston Churchill just gets it right, doesn't he? I mean, that's a classic example. Which chapter is that in? Is that at the beginning of Gathering Storm?
It's in chapter 1, The Folly of the Victors.
Right, yeah. He said it all, hasn't he? I mean, essentially what he's telling us from Beyond the Grave is that if we had been tougher when Putin destabilized Georgia in 2008 and took the Crimea in 2014 and started the breakaway republics in the same year, if perhaps we'd been tougher over Chechnya or earlier on in his blood-stained career, when one thinks of Putin and all the things that he's done over the years, And then all of the presidents of both sides of the aisle in the United States, one after another, who have essentially tried their best to deal with him as a normal human being. Whereas we now discover he was anything but a normal human being. I remember, I'm just like you, I didn't think he'd go into Ukraine. I got it completely wrong as well, because Ukraine is a country of 44 million people. I mean, that is so many more than 1956 in Hungary, where there were 9 million people, or Czechoslovakia in 1968. There were 13 million Afghans in 1979. These are large numbers of people, but nothing like 44 million people who are absolutely, totally up in arms against him. And so as a adventure, it was a ruthless one, of course, but also a reckless one to an extraordinary degree that people like you and me and Eliot, who try to take history as a precedent, just simply could not have foreseen.
I mean, thank goodness there have been surprises in the other direction. I mean, I confess I thought there was a very serious chance that he would go for the whole thing. But what I didn't expect was the unanimity of the Europeans in response, and in particular, it's quite extraordinary pivot by the Germans. Now, who knows if it'll last and so forth. But that's also part of what I think history teaches us, isn't it? That we're going to be continually surprised. And
Yeah.
we usually think about the surprises that we don't like. But then there are also the surprises that we do like. We're including, courage in very unlikely places, including a, comic actor from the Ukraine.
Yes, that's right. And yeah, and every action has its reaction. And you're right. I never for a million years. I mean, imagine this time last month being told that Germany was going to make up a shortfall of 100 billion in its defence spending, that was going to bring up from 1.5 to 2% of GDP its defence spending, was going to send lethal weapons into Ukraine. You think, Germany, of all countries, it's been a neo-pacifist power for 3/4 of a century. I mean, anyone who told you that would be you'd think was insane. And it's all happened in the course of a month.
Andrew, one thing you've written about in Masters and Commanders really well is alliance management. I mean, and you do a marvelous job of depicting the very serious disagreements between the U.S. and the British military leadership during World War II about the direction of strategy. I mean, sometimes when you read the records, you wonder how we won the war. We seem to be fighting with each other almost as hard as we were fighting against the Germans. And you attribute it really to the masterful personalities who were involved: Churchill, Roosevelt, Dill, and Marshall. How do you think the alliance management piece of this has been handled? I mean, Eliot talked about the unanimity of the West. I mean, that didn't just happen, of itself. I mean, obviously there was some diplomacy involved. How would you grade that out?
Yes, I thank you for that comment on Masters and Commanders, and of course Lord Alan Brooke as well was another important figure in those Masters and Commanders, and I should have mentioned alliance management in that list of war leadership attributes that you need. I think that this whole crisis has underlined yet again the importance of having a special relationship between Britain and America. Britain, I'm proud to say, was the first country to start training Ukrainian troops for precisely such a event as this. We were sending lethal aid long before the French or the Germans or any of the other European countries. We have been in the forefront of calling for tough sanctions and so on. So I think that the British example in this is something that I'm proud of. And the great thing is that there are in America, especially in your military, people who have been training with Brits all their careers. They know them. They're in many cases amongst the high commands of both countries personal friends, And there's something there that we've seen, of course, in many conflicts in the past, including some that you two guys have been closely involved in, where Anglo-American cooperation has been of the first order. And I think that that some stumbling that I'm afraid has been noticeable with your president, with President Biden, has been it's been lucky that he has had allies who can keep his sort of nose to the grindstone.
Eliot, I'm going to give you the last word.
The only last word I have is, Andrew, really to thank you for books which I've not only enjoyed but learned from, which I think none of us believe that history has lessons very narrowly understood, but there certainly are much larger kinds of things that we take away, and I find more of those in your books than any other author I know, and I'm deeply grateful for the books, and I'm deeply grateful for your giving us your time. And Benedict Arnold really was a great guy, Eric. I'm going to persuade you of that.
Oh, God. All right. I should never have let you have the last word. Andrew Roberts, thank you so much. I associate myself completely with Eliot's remarks. I've learned enormous amounts from you over the years. I'm deeply in your intellectual debt. And I don't know whether this is a threat or a promise, but when you're done with Disraeli, we'll have you back, if not before.
Thank you. I'm going to take that very much as a promise. You are kind, guys. Thanks very much indeed for having me on your show.
And thanks for joining us on Shield of the Republic. This is Eric Edelman. Shield of the Republic is a product of The Bulwark. And if you're enjoying the podcast, as we hope you are, please consider subscribing to The Bulwark and The Bulwark Plus, which will give you access to all the Bulwark content, including the morning shots and triad newsletters, as well as other podcasts that are behind the paywall. And please make sure to leave a review for us at Shield of the Republic and a comment on the podcast platform, wherever you get your podcasts.